Okay, so without further ado, welcome, Gareth. I will turn things over to you, and if you could please share your screen and start your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Geraint. Can you hear me okay? Is the sound all right?
Yeah, that's fine. That's fantastic.
Okay, right. I will get the presentation up and then we'll start going through it. So should be about 35 minutes. We'll take questions at the end, but there is a thing that comes up with questions as we're going through. So if you have any, anything, we'll try and do them at the end. But any points, just cut in, Geraint, or anything I'm not explaining well. This is a presentation about the Woodland Carbon Code. I'm going to go through a little bit about tree planting in general to begin with, the context within which the Carbon Code fits in Wales. This is not intended to be, a very in-depth run through. The code itself is quite complicated, but this is aimed at landowners, aimed at farmers, and making you sort of more generally aware about what the code is about, how it might work for you, how it might fit in if you're thinking about planting woodland. So,
well, you go on, Gareth. Sorry, can you just expand the screen so we can see the?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm not
okay.
struggling with the thing. Sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Right, is that better?
Yeah, that's great. Fantastic.
Sorry. It looks slightly different my end than what it does from yours. Right. Okay, I work for Coed Cymru. We plant and manage woodland in Wales. Most of our clients are farmers. We're very, very busy at the moment with interest in planting and management actually of woodland. And typically we deal with smaller units in the context of forestry anyway. Anything really 5-10 hectares, that's pretty typical for us. And what I'm going to come back to quite a lot throughout the presentation is the way that we group these things together for the purposes of selling carbon, also selling timber, getting contractors. We do a lot of things through grouping these schemes together and making more viability out of larger units. And this is very much the case with the Woodland Carbon Code. I think we were probably the first to get into Carbon Code in Wales. We're certainly the first group on the registry, and we're the first schemes, still are schemes, the only ones that are validated on there at the moment. But this is expanding really fast. Carbon is really interesting at the moment, and there's a lot of interest in it. So I'll try and capture that as we go through. I'm just going to cover briefly what's driving planting, how we make decisions, and then I'll go on for about 20 minutes or so and explain what the Carbon Code is, how it works, and how the units are created and sold. So this is a typical picture, I use this quite a lot, of upland Wales, and we work with our clients, our landowners, to look at really how woodland and trees might be integrated into this landscape alongside other land uses. The vast majority of our clients are farmers and they want to keep farming, and we're looking at making land use decisions in this context, and there's a number of tools that we use for doing this. We did a woodland creation presentation a couple of weeks ago, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but it is relevant to the carbon question. So a lot of my job is looking at sites like this, looking at constraints, habitat constraints, archaeology, other constraints, lots of places we can't plant trees. In fact, in this picture, there's areas of shale you couldn't plant trees, but there's a lot of opportunity in this landscape for integrating trees into that farm landscape, and that's really what we do day in, day out, and also harvesting timber as well. Now, this is quite interesting in the context of carbon, and we'll come back to this later in terms of species choice, but we're quite aware of the impact of climate change, and Welsh Government came up with this map on the right here. It's a predictive agricultural land classification map, and this is very interesting because at a UK level, there's likely to be quite a significant change in the next 50 years in the agricultural productivity of land in certain regions. And this is particularly interesting in Wales because we might see higher rainfall. We're likely to see greater incidence of drought as well. General more instability, I guess, with climate. But we have to take this into consideration with what we're planting now. So these tools are really interesting. And what we're seeing, I'll come back to this again as well, with the carbon income coming into the woodland income calculations is, for us, certainly a shift towards more diversity in woodland. So typically we plant about 50% conifer and 50% broadleaf on our schemes as a whole, not necessarily in every scheme, but on the whole, that's about what we plant. And I think that's a very resilient sort of model for forestry, and it's quite climate proof as well. So we're very interested in tools that give farmers and landowners the decisions to better target these options. And the 3B land layer, which is the lower grade agricultural productivity land, this is where we see the big opportunity space. And a lot of our schemes we think of in terms of trees within the woodland landscape, like the Pontbren model, shelter and shade and biosecurity. But really the carbon tends to come into play with the slightly larger schemes. I'll come back to that again later, but you know, we're looking at large land parcels being turned over to these woodland options. So we have tools like this. This is the Welsh Government tool. I won't go into this in any detail, but hopefully this is going to change and there'll be a lot more opportunity for planting. The point I wanted to make about carbon, there's a lot of interest in it at the moment, but these are generally the drivers for people to create woodland, and carbon is one of these. And these drivers, timber, habitat, carbon, flood risk, shelter, etc., might vary in weighting in terms of many schemes, but many woodlands and forestry schemes will deliver against a lot of these. So the point is, we're not just considering carbon, or we're not just considering any one of these objectives when we're planting. And particularly, you know, in terms of objectives, there's a wide range of objectives, and we always say, you know, we've got to be quite clear what these are when we're starting to design the schemes. And in terms of carbon, you could get very, you know, very focused on carbon, but it's, you know, we need to consider the wider outputs of woodland as well. Typically working woodlands and harvesting timber, this is going to be an issue in many of even the carbon code scheme woodlands we manage them by finning, or that's the plan that goes into the calculations, and we need to allow for access. You know, these are the sorts of machines that work these woodlands. I try and bring this slide up, you know, often, because the two factors in the economic success, we do a lot of harvesting as well as planting. And we typically deal with smaller blocks. We're not really into big forestry. And for us, the two key factors to a woodland being successful economically in a wider sense are you have the right trees and they're growing well and managed, but you also have access for working and haulage. So even though we're focusing on carbon, we're not forgetting these factors either in the scheme design. And so I'll go on now to talk about the background to the carbon code, what options there are for certifying carbon, and then we'll go through as briefly as I can without using too much confusing jargon, because it is confusing, just briefly how the scheme works and what you might expect. I'm just trying to raise awareness, I guess, of what it is, what's involved, and just so you've got an idea about the stages. So the UK has a number of climate commitments, nationally and internationally. You know, we hear about this more and more, and where the Woodland Carbon Code fits into this. This is a UK government scheme, and it's a standard for assessing schemes against to verify the amount of carbon that they are creating. Where this fits into the UK climate commitment is that these units that are created through the scheme can be bought and used by companies and individuals to compensate for their UK-based greenhouse gas emissions. That's the basis of the role of the Woodland Carbon Code standard in the UK. Now, I'm not necessarily here to sell the Woodland Carbon Code. We operate a scheme that certifies things against it. There are arguments for and against this approach, but this is just to outline what it is. This is what it's about. About a year ago, all the quoted companies on the stock exchange were required to report the greenhouse gas emissions. So this affected quite a lot of companies. It was so over 10,000 companies are now having to quantify and report the greenhouse gas emissions. There's still no compulsion, but this is something that is we're moving in the direction of a lot more clarity and transparency and scrutiny, I guess, about the greenhouse gas emissions of organisations and companies. The carbon units can't be used in compliance schemes, certainly at the moment, but there are quite a number of rules that are going to change around in this area in the next year or two. So it'll be quite interesting to see, what's happening. So the role of woodlands in the carbon cycle is very briefly as follows. Very basically, woodlands trees absorb CO2, and they store that carbon in two ways, typically, in the biomass content of the wood, so the dry weight matter of the wood, and the soil carbon under the wood. And when the trees are harvested and used, that timber can be stored, sometimes for a very long time, in products, timber products. So the carbon code is quite complex. We'll very briefly look at the spreadsheet in a minute, but it's basically quantifying the carbon that's stored in these projects, captured and stored in these projects, and then we're creating units out of that. So we're seeing carbon become an increasingly important part of the income and the financial considerations around planting. And typically, if you discount value, when you discount back from when you expect to receive the income, this is very roughly what you can expect. Timber's about 35% of the income, carbon's 25% of the income, and grants in Wales at the moment are about 40% of the income, typical per scheme. It's very, very rough figures, but it gives you an indication that carbon is becoming quite significant, and this is leading to a wider diversity in forests management from our perspective. From a buyer's perspective, they are typically interested in buying units on the registry. We'll come to that in a minute. Or they're also interested in buying land themselves to plant and grow their own units effectively. We tend not to, as Coed Cymru, deal with that type of client. Typically, we tend to deal with farmers that are continuing to farm their land, and they're creating new woodland and forestry. So we're typically marketing and selling those units on their behalf. And there's a lot of, the main reasons companies are doing this, it's for corporate social responsibility. That, as I said above, is also a drive now, much more interest in carbon neutrality. And there's also a lot of speculation that goes on. So still quite early days. These are the validated projects. So these are the ones that are selling their units now in the UK. This is as of 30th of June. Obviously, the last 3 months, there'll be more. The ones in Wales, I think they're all ours at the moment. But, this shows a position about a year ago. And these are the projects that are under development, and there are a lot more than this in the pipeline that haven't even reached this registration stage. So this is something that's growing really quickly. So what is the role of a carbon code scheme? So what it's effectively doing is, for each ton of carbon that your woodland project, planting project is storing, sequestering, you're creating a tradable commodity called a woodland carbon unit, which you can sell to one of these buyers. And that's effectively what the Woodland Carbon Code is. It's verifying and validating those units against the standard, and it's assuring the buyer that the trees are there, that the carbon is being sequestered, and what they're buying is a robust scheme. And the UK scheme, I think, is pretty robust in a global context, based on what I've seen of it. So you have to have it's independently verified or validated. We don't do that. It's very much like how timber certification works, as an independent third party that audits our compliance with the Woodland Code standard, and effectively is a third party assurance scheme. There are three main standards. The Woodland Carbon Code isn't the only one. There's Gold Standard, which is a global scheme, and there's also a scheme called Vera, which is a global scheme. There is another one, but it doesn't quite create the tradable commodities in the way that this one does. So I'm going to just talk about the Woodland Carbon Code, which is our UK scheme. But we also are interested in the more global schemes as well, and selling our unit or our clients' units on a global platform as well. There's a lot of opportunity there. So again, it's all about credibility. It's a voluntary standard, as I said, and it's quite complex. So in order to certify your project, it's not a straightforward matter. If you go on to the Woodland Carbon Code website, you will see the standard against which the projects are assessed. The way that the carbon is calculated is quite complex, and really every scheme is different to another one. So depending on the ground preparation, there's a whole lot of factors that affect it. So these are the sort of the steps that you go through in order to certify your scheme against the Woodland Carbon Code. Now, obviously, you can do this directly yourself, but the vast majority of these schemes will be done through a group, and that's typical. I can't imagine many of these projects going through this process on their own. So the process involves three main steps. So you've planted or are at the point of planting your scheme, and you decide that you want to create woodland carbon units to sell at some point in the future. And these are the three main processes that you will go through. You will register your project with the Woodland Carbon Code, or you'll join a group like the Coetiroedd group, for example, and we will do that as part of the group. We'll register the group and all the schemes with the registry. So that's basically the start of the process. And you can register a single project. We tend to, the small projects, 5 to 10 hectares, we tend to group because it lowers the cost. You've got draft calculations at this stage, but you've got a rough idea of what your scheme will sequester. So it's all based on a forecast, and I'll show you the spreadsheet very shortly. The next stage, once your project's registered, and typically when they're planted, we tend to do this after planting, is validation. And this now then involves an external verifier, external consultant, soil association certification. They're the ones that we use. There is another one. I think Akura used to do it. I think it's that organic farmers and growers do it now. But there's two or three external verifiers that you can hire to do this. So validation is basically going through the basic legal documents. You own the land, all that basic stuff, and then you're creating the full calculations about your scheme. At that point, your scheme can go on the register, and there are two forms of tradable units that you can create. At the point of planting, at the validation stage, you create what they call PIUs, pending issuance units. The PIUs are effectively a promise to deliver carbon because the scheme hasn't been verified yet. So it's kind of a bit more risky, but they can be sold. And in fact, a lot of schemes do sell the PIUs to contribute to the costs of planting. So I'll come back to this again, but you've got validation, which is PIUs. At year 5, and thereafter every 10 years, the project goes through a process of verification. It's really confusing, the terms they use. I always get them the wrong way around. But verification is another check by an external body that the trees are there, they're at the right density, they're growing at the rate, roughly at the rate that you predicted. So most of the risk at year 5 is gone. You've gone past the point of the risk, and you've got a reasonable idea at year 5 what your planting scheme is going to look like in year 20, 30, 40 once you get to that stage, because the trees have established to a point at which you can make reasonable predictions. So at that point, the risk reduces. And at that point, once the verifier is happy, the PIUs that you've lodged on the register can become woodland carbon units. And those are the full sort of tradable commodity under the Woodland Carbon Code. So I hope that makes sense. Those are the basic 3 steps. And you can see this diagram as the project proceeds, time along the bottom, and the trees are growing. The curve, a dotted line, the curve is roughly equal to the rate of carbon sequestration that your project is likely to do. So you can see if you're selling units up front at year 5, you haven't really sequestered that much carbon. So if you're selling the units based on what you're expecting in year 25, 30, 40, the woodland has still got a long way to go to meet that commitment. So there's a risk involved there. When you get to year 10, 15, the carbon in the woodland is really ramping up. And of course, the carbon is there, it's verifiable. So you're into the realm, I guess, of options and futures and, risk when you're selling the units early on in the process. And I'll come back to this again, but it's like who takes that risk is quite important. But that's typically what you'd expect as your planting scheme progresses in terms of what the units are and how they're created. So there are various things that affect the carbon in the schemes. The species of tree that you're planting, the density, of course, the physical volume of timber and dry weight matter that's in your scheme, the soil type, the site has a big impact on the carbon. Sequestered peatland soils typically release more carbon. If they're deep peat, certainly they do. So we're not allowed to do that anyway under environmental law, but certain soils will release more carbon planting or indeed at clear fell. So that's an issue. The ground preparation is a continuous mounder work in there. How that, the type of ground preparation, that has an impact. That's taken account of in the calculations. And then your yield class, as it's called in forestry, it's the speed the trees are growing. But of course, it's the density of dry weight matter, carbon in the species that matters, and how they accumulate in the soil. So it's that point really that we're seeing more of a drive towards a bit more of a mixture. Even in commercial forests, we're seeing that in our schemes. How you manage thinning and clear fell, that has a big impact on the carbon, and and as I said, spreading risk and income is quite key to some of these schemes. The basis of the carbon code in terms of its forecasting is a really interesting tool, and if you haven't seen this is well worth looking at. It's published by Forest Research, and it's called ESC. I always forget at the last minute what this stands for, but it's it says at the top there, Ecological Site Classification Tool, ESC. If you look up ESC tool, Forest Research, you'll get to this page, and you can find your planting site. For some reason, this one is just south of Machynlleth, and it's just a dot I probably clicked, and you will get at the bottom of this map all the climate data that relating to that site: elevation, wind risk. There's a lot of modelling. It's not perfect, but there's a lot of modelling that Forest Research have done. And then as you scroll down, I haven't really got room to show it on here, but as you scroll down, you'll see a list of tree species that are suitable for that site, suitable or less suitable, but you'll get these codes in green. You can see the key, and it'll give you a predicted yield class, which is, if I can point with the mouse, this column here, YC, and that 16 means on average, based on the yield curves the Forestry Commission use, 16 cubic meters per hectare per year. Based on the dry weight density of the species, timber, the density of the timber, you can basically work out the amount of carbon sequestered, plus calculations for what's in the soil. So everything that's based, the Woodland Carbon Code is effectively based on this sort of modelling, and there's nothing stopping you. Forest Research, ESC, you can go on here yourself and have a look. And we often use this. We do a lot of harvesting, planting, measuring, certainly around Machynlleth and Eglwys, Mid Wales area, North West Wales, and Ceredigion, in fact. So we do a lot of measuring as well about what we actually seeing as volumes, and that's really useful information too. And this is pretty good as a guide. This system. So I don't think I'm actually, what time is it? I'm not going to go into the spreadsheet. It is horrendously complicated, but basically what you're doing is you're taking information like this from ESC. You are inputting all the site characteristics and the site factors into an Excel spreadsheet. It's actually on the Woodland Carbon Code website. All of this is available, downloadable from there, and the spreadsheet will work out the tons per hectare, or the tons rather, in your scheme that your scheme is predicted to sequester. And then so suppose you've got a scheme which is, say, a 10 hectare scheme, and you're sequestering 3,000 tons, for example. 3,000 tons will go on the register. Which will then command a price per unit, and your validation and verification program as part of the code will basically check that those units are there, and it'll revise the figure up and down. That's very roughly how it works. So there's a couple of points to make, and then we'll go on to the registry and how the units are then dealt with once you've got that far. So this is this concept called additionality, which I think is a terrible word, but terrible use of language anyway. But additionality is one of the concepts that underpins the Woodland Carbon Code. So it's the concept that carbon income is driving more woodland creation. So we've got to demonstrate, as I did above, in fact, that the carbon income is making a significant contribution to the return on investment to the schemes, and that the buyers are, you know, genuinely contributing to increased woodland planting area. So this is this concept. What it also means, and we get asked this a lot, but this concept of new additional carbon sequestration means that the carbon code, at least, only applies to new woodland. It does not apply to existing woodland, no matter how well you're managing it, and it doesn't apply to restocking woodland once it's been felled, because there's a legal obligation typically to do so under the Forestry Act. So, you know, like government grants, I guess, in a way, they don't typically cover legal obligations, and this concept of additionality, you know, I think is an issue in some respects, but it is what it is. That's the Woodland Carbon Code. So when you hear that it's only new planting that it applies to, that's basically why. So I'll just go through the monitoring process very quickly. Again, I probably said this already, but you've got a year 5 monitoring program that creates the PIUs, the pending carbon units, and this is really to ensure that the site has been stocked properly, the number of trees are there, you know, the weeding's been done. If you're planting under a grant scheme, or, you know, anyone that's planting that's, you know, wanting to produce timber, you'll be doing this anyway. You know, basic maintenance of the site. We typically, you know, look after sites as much as we can now. As, you know, as much resources that can go into maintenance and management, you know, the better. And the carbon code, you know, this is another form of, you know, reason to look after your planting sites. So, you know, year 5, you're basically checking trees are there in the right density. You know, you've planted what you've said you were going to plant in the design document, that kind of thing. So it's just a general checkup really of your scheme at year 5. But nevertheless, if you pass that, your pending issuance units on the register will become fully tradable woodland carbon units, or they'll reach the full value anyway. You then wait another 10 years after year 5, and you then have, and of course nobody's done this yet because, I mean, the scheme hasn't been going that long. So the year 15 will essentially be a check. Really, it'll involve, you know, typical techniques of forest measurement, you know, working out the yield class is against what you predicted, the trees are there, you know, the volume of timber is there. It's all fairly standard forestry techniques, but nevertheless it'll have to be done and verified by a third party. My writing is in red. So yeah, the risk at year 15, once you get to that stage, your risk profile of your planting scheme is pretty much the risk profile of forestry in general. So anything bad that's going to happen other than catastrophic wind blow or disease, is, you know, anything bad that's going to happen has probably happened by year 15. So by year 15, you kind of know what you're going to get when the plantation is mature, or you start to thin it, or etc. So it's all pretty standard, but you know, it's got to be done. And yeah, and probably when we get to that point, with a bit of luck, technology will have accelerated by then as well, and we'll be able to do some of this remotely, which will reduce the cost of the scheme. So so you've got your project on the registry, you've got the monitoring program, etc. Most of our schemes will come through our group, so we'll be doing all this for you if you're one of our clients. So you've got your draft projects, then they'll become under development. You'll typically be planting at about this time. Your project is validated, and then it's verified. So those are the 4 stages. So question we're often asked then, so you've got these units, whether they're pending units or full units, what do you do with them then? Well, basically it's up to you. Once they're on the register, they're available for companies and individuals, in fact, to buy. So your effect is just like having a parcel of timber, really. Your units are there. Now you can decide when you sell those units. You can sell them all up front. You can sell them at each point of verification. It's pretty much entirely up to you. Each contract for the units is effectively a private contract between you as the seller and the buyer. So, you know, it's very flexible in terms of how you realize the income. A lot of our clients are not wanting to sell at the early stage, at the pending stage, because obviously the risk is higher, the price is lower. So we tend not to sell. We haven't actually sold any units at the PIU stage. So most of our clients are hanging on, but doubtless, you know, people do sell at the PIU stage. So, the other thing, you can't use the PIUs. So the customer buying the PIU cannot use them immediately to offset. They have to transfer into Woodland Carbon units. So they'd have to buy them and hold them for a number of years before they turn into WCUs. So the risk is higher and the price is therefore lower. The way it works when they are used to offset by the buyer, they are basically retired, so that they become on the register retired, and that eliminates any sort of double counting. So it's a fairly robust system of tracking who's bought and sold what unit, and every unit relates back, well currently it does, every unit relates back to a particular woodland and you know, that was planted at a particular time. So there's that level of robustness, I guess, to it. This is quite interesting. This is the current state, well, as of the 30th of June, state of the carbon units on the registry. Now you can see there's only 7,000 woodland carbon units, which means that those projects are more than 5 years old and they've been verified. 2.6 million pending issuance units, and of those 1.4 million have been sold already. So quite a lot of landowners are deciding to do that. And you know, it's up to you. It's your decision. Right, I'm nearly at the end actually, so there's a couple of questions that's come up, so I'll just finish this and then we'll go on to the questions. Probably the best thing to do. So a couple of points. The buying and selling of units, it's, as I said, it's effectively a private contract, the terms of which, you know, you need to consider. The process is creating these units. The market registry records these units. They are effectively dependent on the trees growing at what you said they were going to grow at. And, you know, you've always got to think about the risk in these situations. So if you're selling the units up front, it's a future promise to deliver that carbon. So you've got to bear in mind that you've got the risk in keeping to your side of the bargain. You sell your units, and you know, you've got to make sure those trees are there. You know, it's a commitment to do so. So, you know, we always remind people about that. Now, obviously, there are costs of participating in this scheme. It's not a straightforward process. Each point at which, each point in the process requires a lot of time and input. We only do our own schemes. So we did start off, when we did the first scheme, the first one that was done in Wales, we did open it up to others, planting schemes that we hadn't managed. And we decided not to do that going forward. So everything we do now is we collect a lot of this information as we're doing, there's a grant scheme plan or something like that involved. So we keep the costs down, we keep the process as streamlined as we can. And we tend to only do our own schemes. So there's a cost at each one of these each one of these stages. And that does mean that a scheme will typically need to be of a certain size. Now, I'm not really able to say what that size is, because that's something that we know, having done it. But we have a typical minimum size of scheme because of the cost involved. So, but the group model significantly lowers the size that becomes viable. So we're seeing a lot more schemes are able to enter the process and sell their carbon units. And obviously the price has been going up quite considerably recently as well. And as the price goes up, obviously a lot more schemes are viable. I just wanted to raise this. You probably have heard of this if you've been looking at carbon, but there's an English Woodland Carbon Guarantee Scheme running at the moment. I think it runs every 6 months, and schemes in England are able to bid into this scheme at a carbon price, and the DEFRA, English government, will basically underwrite the carbon price, and you can put your scheme forward, and you can basically put forward the price that you want for your carbon units, and they effectively, or I guess they probably just go up the list, in low to high until they run out of money. I guess that's how it works. So possibly we might see something like this in the future in Wales, but this is an interesting way, a potentially interesting way that these sort of schemes can be incentivized or certainly de-risked. Again, there's a National Forest for Wales programme that Welsh Government are running at the moment, and they're developing this. And I was asked, certainly in the last presentation, just to raise this by Welsh Government. And basically, this is an opportunity. There will be open events. I think there's one on the 8th of October. You'll have to check. Geraint will tell you. And this program needs your input. So, the more you tell this program what you want to see, not just carbon, but, whole range of schemes supporting farming, these are the things that they want to hear now. So I'll just raise that quickly. Again, Coed Cymru, that's us. We've got a website, obviously, coed.cymru. We're based in Machynlleth, but we cover most of Mid Wales, North Wales, West Wales and South Wales. So we're pretty prevalent. I hope that made sense. It's quite boring, but I'm open. We'll answer any questions that you've made.
Great, thank you very much, Gareth. Diolch yn fawr iawn I ti. We have a few questions that have come in, so we'll go straight into those, and keep them coming in if you can. The first one's in two parts, actually. Thank you for a clear presentation. You did say, Gareth, that it only applies to new woodlands. Are there any talks or any discussion about that changing on new schemes for existing woodland? It is a question that's asked quite a bit, so yeah, if you can answer that one.
It is. I'm not really, if I'm honest, I'm probably not close enough to the policy decisions on the UK standard to answer that properly. I mean, I would really like to see the carbon, the carbon impact of well-managed woodland, and properly thinned woodland, and bringing woodland back into management. There's a lot of broadleaf woodland particularly, but also conifer, that would really benefit from management and would have a carbon impact. And I'd really like to see that recognised. Whether that's going to happen through the Woodland Carbon Code, I don't know, but it's effectively, this is moving into the realm of it's attracting private funding into these models, and corporate social responsibility funding. So even if the Woodland Carbon Code doesn't move in that direction, it might be, I'm not close enough to it to know, but there are other standards like the global standards that might, and that's something that we're really interested in. But at the moment, I'm not aware of anything at the moment in the UK.
Okay, thanks, Gareth. Second part of this question here, you mentioned that it isn't possible to fell existing woodland and restock. I mean, by that, I think it isn't eligible for the carbon code. Can you explain that, and what are the legal obligations involved?
Right. Well, so most existing woodland, with very few exceptions, is subject to the Forestry Act, or private woodland is. So you will need a felling license. Now, there's a presumption in the Forestry Act 1967 that all existing woodland, with few exceptions, shall remain as woodland. And if you have and the way this works in practice is affected by the felling license. So you apply for felling license, you'll normally have a restocking obligation. Now, that means that that piece of land will be replanted, and NRW are quite, one of the things they are good at actually is policing the felling license system. It works quite well in that respect. If you haven't planted it, they will find out, and they'll usually come and check. So in that respect, you have a fairly robust legal responsibility when you're felling trees and managing woodland. So as I go back to that slide on the additionality, that is something that the Woodland Carbon Code people that set the policy feel is not something that the Woodland Carbon Code will cover, is an existing legal obligation, and there's other precedents for that as well.
Okay.
I'm not saying I agree with it. I'm just saying that's the position.
Yeah. Thanks, Gareth. How long are these units set for? How long do they offset for?
I didn't say that. I should have done. Basically, your project, the length of your project is effectively up to you. Now, obviously, the longer the period, the more units. It's like a bell curve, typically, how it works. So most of our projects will probably run for about 45, 50 years. After that, the rate of accumulation tails off as it, with the yield class. So it's a bit more complicated than that. But basically, you could have a project for 20 years, but you wouldn't sequester probably enough carbon to make it worthwhile in a 10 hectare scheme. So typically 45, 55 years, but it's up to you. You specify that.
Okay. I suppose with productive woodland, it would depend on rotations and end crop.
Well, that's what I mean about saying, the carbon is one part of the outputs of the woodland. So, you might be wanting to produce timber, by thinning, perhaps you might want to clear fell at year 35. That's maybe your main objective. Now, the thing is, you may go for that option. It's not the maximum amount of carbon that you're sequestering, but in terms of your scheme, it might be the maximum value to you that scheme is delivering. So that's what I mean about you need to consider all the reasons why you're planting, and take a decision that maximizes that overall. Even if it's biodiversity, you might actually want to plant a different spec to that that's maximizing your carbon.
Yeah, and which leads us to the next question, really, what you partially answered. What can you do with the timber at the end of it, or does it always have to be alive? Does the carbon calculation take into account the end product and how much carbon will be released back into the atmosphere in the process? For example, firewood will release 70–100% depending if it's soft or hardwood. Hardwood roots will decompose but still sequester carbon. So
yes. Sorry, what was the first bit of that question?
What can you do with the timber at the end?
Oh yeah, so no, it's up to you. It's like exactly like I said. So your project design plan, when you go for the first stage, the validation is the first stage, will contain within it your objectives, and it will contain within it things like the rotation length, you know, all that stuff. So it's up to you to put that into the design plan, and the carbon is calculated accordingly. So if I had a scheme and I wanted a clear fell within 40 years, I could do. I could have the same scheme and I decided, you know, maybe a bit more broadleaf in it, and I was going to manage that by long-term thinning. That, for example, might give me more carbon, but it might not be what I want in terms of growing timber. Or like I said, with access, you know, it might not be the right thing for that site to grow a particular thing. So you've got to make all these decisions, and then your carbon calculation comes out of that, and you try and maximize the value overall. And then in terms of what happens to the timber afterwards, my understanding, I'm not an expert on the policy of this actually, but my understanding, it's certainly as far as the carbon code goes, is that it stops at the end of the forest cycle and then it starts again. I don't think, it's certainly in the Woodland Carbon Code, the carbon usage after, or what happens to the timber, is not factored into the carbon calculations, because how could you factor that in at year naught? You know, it's not feasible to do so.
Okay, thank you. Next question: would an 18-month-old woodland planted through Welsh Woodland Creation Scheme be considered as a new woodland and still be eligible for the scheme?
Yes, but do it quick, because you'll have to register within 2 years of planting. So that'll have to be registered sharpish. But yes, it could be done. And, you know, again, you'll have to make a decision, cost benefit, as to whether it's worth it. But if it's a scheme of a reasonable size, then yeah, it's probably worth doing.
Okay. Next question: of the existing woodlands in Wales, and including the small parcels that are currently productive or have immediate potential, if not currently managed, how right is it and that the Woodland Carbon Code, and how daring is it that they not support restock of existing woodland?
Well, I think I've answered that. I mean, I don't make the rules. It's not, you know, it's not my rules, but that is the rule of additionality. And, you know, it's like government grants. They don't usually fund things that are a legal obligation. So part of the robustness of the UK, actually, as a country, you know, on the international stage, probably one of the few things we maintain is that, you know, our environmental policy in terms of forestry is actually quite good, because, you know, when you look at carbon in other, you know, you're looking at carbon at a global level, the UK is quite robust because we have those basic levels of legal protection for forestry, which some other countries don't have. So, you know, it's that additionality concept. You'd have to challenge that. Now, it's Woodland Carbon Code, so, you know, we could go to gold standard, we could go to Vera, as I said, you know, and we can maybe get a different answer, and we're thinking about it, but it's, you know, it's a time that you got to put into these things to develop a scheme. But I would really like to see woodland management in general, you know, properly recognized. You know, I'd really like to see that. I think it would be very popular, and we hear this all the time.
Okay. can you register a 5-year Glastir, 5-year-old Glastir woodland into this scheme?
No, I don't think so. You missed the boat, unfortunately. But again, not my rules, but my understanding is you have to register in 2 years. I think that's about to change actually to 6 months. So, you know, it might have changed actually very recently. So we need to, you need to be thinking about this at the design stage really before the trees are planted. I'll check that registration period.
Okay. There's a comment here more than a question, really. That it maybe should be part of a new BPS system, post-Brexit, with regards to the carbon code, or not the carbon code, as the case may be.
Well, I think it's a tool in the box, and I think it's personally, it's, you know, there are advantages and disadvantages with all these schemes. I mean, if you're looking purely at a carbon guarantee scheme, it means that the landowner's got to fund the costs of planting up front, and that currently isn't the case. So when you're looking at these options, I think it's good to have incentives there for carbon, because it's, you know, it's hugely important, and it's a good driver. But you know, it's, you know, farmers that are not wanting to sell their land, you know, an upfront investment cost is a different set of criteria. So, you know, if you only had one model, you would probably end up incentivizing a certain category of person over another. And I think that needs a lot of thought and impact assessment.
Okay. Another question here: does woodland creation affect current Glastir payments and basic payments?
Well, no, because you'd have to be out of advanced to go into glass tier woodland creation. But anything currently under RDP, forestation under RDP, is currently compatible with retaining BPS. So as long as you're claiming BPS, my understanding is, and the land was used to claim BPS in 2008, then, which most land is that we come across, then most of our clients are claiming BPS when they're planting under glass tier. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And there is a question about, will the copy of the presentation slides be available? I should say this has been recorded, and it will be released on YouTube over the next few days. So it'll be there available for you. And the next question after that, when referring to a group, does it mean that a group of farmers, landowners, come together to do an application?
Well, it could do, yes. You know, we have lots of landscape scale schemes, yeah. When we talk about a group, in the context of the carbon, it would be a group of schemes that have been planted usually in the same planting year, and we would then, not all the schemes maybe, but we would group them together to take them, to register them and put them on the you know, go through the process as a group. So yeah, they typically are groups of farmers, but they're not necessarily all in the same area. But there's no reason why we look at that, certainly. You know, especially if there's other source of income, you know, involved in the scheme as well. For like, say, a catchment project that had funding for catchment restoration, and woodland creation was part of that, and it was done at enough scale, then yeah, certainly we could do something like that.
Okay, something like the sustainable management scheme.
That kind of thing, yeah.
Okay. There's another comment here. I don't know if you want to comment on it. It sounds like you can sell carbon that hasn't been made yet or hasn't been produced yet. So polluting companies can burn more carbon before you've made it. It's polluting furthers climate change, which will hinder the tree's growth with drought, etc. I suppose. It's as you said, Gareth, that these are the rules and how the code works at the moment.
I'm not sure that is necessarily happening. but it is a potential scenario, yeah. I mean, I'm not necessarily a fan. I'm not sold on the concept of offsetting personally, but from our point of view, you know, we are there to create and manage woodland, and what the scheme is doing is recognising the role of that woodland in sequestering carbon, and I think that's a good thing. You know, it's a real driver for planting, and it's just becoming a real driver for planting. So, you know, those are policy questions really for the, you know, for the scheme to answer.
Okay, this next question relates to a specific area, region, and it states that given the Woodland Carbon Code was initiated to preserve the Amazon, should areas of lineage tree cover, specifically the Clydach Gorge Beechwood, going up to the Rock Bryn Mawr, should this area be eligible? I'm not aware of that area, and I'm not, is it a mature woodland?
I'm not sure that's quite what the Woodland Carbon Scheme was designed for. I mean, this is about UK climate commitments. Now, part of that is obviously maintaining and managing existing woodland, like I said, but you know, this is about reducing carbon emissions in the UK. So I'm not sure really what it's got to do with the Amazon. The FSC is more, you know, the timber certification is probably more aligned to that.
Yeah, good point regarding the FSC. Can you provide any examples of the price of a carbon unit?
No, I'm sorry. You know, this is going to go out on YouTube, etc., and I can't. I'm not discussing costs and prices because that's something that's inherent to our scheme. What I will say, the global price of carbon is about, you know, it has been £3 or £4 a ton, probably less. I could go out and buy that. You know, I could go out and buy carbon for that sort of money. Now, that's not going to incentivize woodland creation in Wales, but what we have seen, there's a number of drivers that have significantly increased that price. So we are seeing, you know, prices of, you know, a lot more than that, and that's quite a recent thing. The Woodland Carbon Guarantee Scheme, it was in England, it was interesting because the first round, or the last round before this one, was £24 people were bidding at, and the last round was £19. So you could expect somewhere in between the global price of £3 or £4 a ton for possibly less robust projects, and something like, you know, the high teens in terms of prices at the moment.
Okay.
I can't say what we're expecting in our group. I can't, you know, I can't. There's certain things I can't say. Sorry.
Okay, no, that's fine. Just another comment here. The question or the comment a few moments ago, the BPS Brexit comment. Just to clarify, it was about the legal obligations of reforesting, as it would be planted anyway. So there's no additional carbon made. Well, you have explained that it's not eligible for restocking. So I think that was.
Oh, I don't quite understand the question. Sorry.
Oh, it was a comment really more than anything.
Oh, okay.
BPS Brexit comment. It was about the legal obligation of reforesting. What is the legal obligation?
Oh, of reforesting. Oh, there's no compulsion to plant. There's no compulsion to plant new areas that are not existing woodland and forest. There's no compulsion to plant, and never has been. And as far as I'm aware, I don't think there will. There might be incentives to plant, but there's no compulsion. So the compulsion is for land that is existing woodland and forestry. If it's felled, it doesn't apply to thinning. If it's felled, then you have to restock. But new land there isn't, and I'm not aware of any. I'm not aware of any proposals to make farmers plant trees.
No, but if it is a clear fell, there is a legal obligation to restock.
Correct. Yes.
And it is planted and it's not always the case that it would be planted anyway. So which is why the condition is there.
Well, there is, because you get fined by NRW, and they are quite robust at that, actually.
Yeah. Okay. So what liabilities are there if you're in a group with other or strangers, it says here, but other woodland or new woodland owners? So we say.
Yeah, very good question. We have rules in the scheme, and there are, and you when you put these groups forward, you have to have rules in the scheme, which deal with situations, and it's the same with timber, about one member defaulting and how that impacts on the other members. So I'm not going to say exactly what our rules are, but there will be rules in there that will protect the other members if one member defaults, because effectively you're not selling the carbon units as a group. All what you're doing is you know, the units are still, even at a group level, the units still are linked to your planting scheme. So if you know, unless they're bought, which they're not. So in our group, the units are linked back to each scheme. So the group is basically the verification, the validation, not necessarily the sale and the transfer of risk, if that makes sense. So there's usually quite a clear line between the unit. Well, there is a clear line between the unit and the trees that they come from. So if somebody else, you know, has an issue, it shouldn't affect your unit. What the group does is it pulls everything together for the process of verification. That's basically how it works.
So in effect, you have a constitution that everybody signs up to.
There are rules to the scheme. Yes, it's not quite as formal as a constitution, but something like that.
Okay. Also, I might have missed it, but can you just explain the buffer?
I've tried not to go into too many details, but there are buffers in the calculation. So you're not selling all the units that's in your scheme. So there's a buffer which is in every scheme, so that it does allow for, you know, some problem. You have got a bit of a buffer. You haven't sold everything. There are some safeguards like that, but you know, the risk issue of selling something, you're selling a future promise to deliver that carbon in the future, you know, as was pointed out, and that is a risk.
Okay. And what happens if a landowner has to sell his or her land, and they're in a Woodland Carbon Code scheme, and they've had, you know, it's been verified, they received marketable value for those units. What's the situation if that land is sold?
I haven't had that situation occur, to be honest, but I would imagine it would just be a case of a private contract between the vendor and the buyer of the land. I would have thought it would be something that would be negotiated as part of the sale, because it's very like a way leave. You know, I bought some land and there were telegraph poles on it, loads of them, and you know, but the previous owner had taken the way leave as a lump sum. So you know, that was actually a factor in the sale. So it'd probably be something like that. But I haven't actually dealt with that situation, so I don't know the exact answer, but it'll be something like that.
Okay, I suppose I mean, just in the last 4 to 5 years, the scheme's evolved quite a bit. Yeah. I'm right in saying that, Gareth. So,
well, you can see from those figures, like 7,000 units, UK-wide, 7,000 units are verified, and they got 2.6 million that have come online effectively in the last 5 years. So you can see how quickly the scheme has grown. A lot of these things, you're asking the right questions. Absolutely, but I just haven't got. I'm sure there's an answer to it. I haven't got the answer on my fingertips, and I'm not, you know, pretending that I have.
Okay, and then referring back to the liabilities for members in the group. Once you're signed up to that group, are you then stuck in the same group permanently?
Well, again, that's the rules of the scheme. And, you know, in our case, not, because again, we're only grouping the verification for verification and validation. So, you know, if you want to come out of the group, that's fine. But obviously, you know, that'll just be reflected in the cost of, you know, there'll be something in the contract, you know, to that effect. You know, it's not, you know, it's not going to be particularly onerous. But you know, if yeah, I can't see it being an issue. It'll be in the terms of the agreement.
Okay. Another question here. If the scheme has been going 4 to 5 years in Wales, why has it not been brought to our attention sooner? But I mean, this scheme was actually launched in 2012.
Yeah, something like that. Well, we've only just, I mean, we did the first group scheme. So all of our clients are aware of it. And we did that 2 years ago. So it's quite new. And it's only recently that it's really picked up momentum certainly in terms of the price. So, you know, all our clients are aware of it. Well,
I think I should also add that going back to 2015-16, that Farm Connect have been raising awareness of it, and we have held events at that time on farm with regards to Woodland Carbon Code as it was developing, and have also adhered to it in numerous new planting scheme events and webinars that we've spoken about. So yeah, it's and it's also been quite a bit of it on social media over the last 4 years as well. So it's yeah, but obviously not getting out to everybody, but it is gaining momentum now, of course, as you mentioned. And there is one more question that's come in. Given volatility of sale and disease that precipitates clear fell of larch and ash, existing productive woodland is a better product source than newly created woodland if restocked. How do woodland managers progress with the carbon market? We can't plant larch or ash anymore anyway at this point in time. But with existing, with existing ash in plantations over the last, you know, going back a few years ago, that have gone into the scheme, how will they cope with that?
Well, I don't quite understand the question. Sorry. What?
So given the volatility of sales,
yeah.
Disease that precipitate clear fell of larch and ash. So when they get the disease, etc., and there's enforcement notices, existing productive woodland is a better product source than newly created woodland. So it's the old argument of why isn't this eligible for existing managed woodlands? So a newly created woodland, if restocked. So how do woodland managers progress with the carbon market? Well,
sorry, I don't disagree. There isn't a route at the moment for managers of existing woodland to enter into the Woodland Carbon Code. It's something that we are thinking about exploring. To my knowledge, I'm not, like I said at the beginning, I'm not close enough to the policy decisions in the Woodland Carbon Code to know that for sure. But at the moment, I'm not aware of any moves to you know, quantify and reward people for, you know, for maintaining and increasing carbon in existing woodland. So, you know, that's something, you know, we have looked at it. We have thought about how we might approach it. Whether that's done through the Woodland Carbon Code or another scheme, I don't know. You know, but we are just so busy at the moment. I just don't have the resources available at the moment, if I'm honest, to pursue that for us. Although it's something, you know, we are thinking about, but it's you know, those are the rules of the scheme. You know, if we get a buyer coming forward who wants to invest in woodland management, and they want to buy carbon credits from, you know, good woodland management, then, you know, by all means, you know, we'll create a scheme for them.
Yeah.
If it, you know, it's of a certain scale, I absolutely. But at the moment, you know, I'm, you know, we're flat out, you know, with what we do. I just haven't got the resources at the moment to do it. Maybe it's something, again, you know, like I said, with the National Forest, you know, there's a real role for something like the National Forest to reward landowners for doing that, particularly, you know, farmers that are managing the woodland, for example. You know, bringing woodland that hasn't been managed into good environmental condition is having a big impact on carbon, stored carbon, soil carbon. You know, that, for example, is important too. And people thin in conifer. You know, we do a lot of thinning, and you know, that's increasing timber quality, and it's contributing to yield. So, you know, there's a whole range of these options that are not recognised. And you look at the National Forest, the brought slide up there. You know, these are the sorts of points that we should be making, you know, as a sector who are managing the woodland into Welsh Government. You know, and you've got opportunities to do that. So that's what I would suggest, you know, doing, and we do that as well. But it needs a lot of people saying the same thing, you know, and a lot of people do.
Yeah, thanks, Gareth. And with that, I'm going to draw slightly to a close, and just mention that we have a webinar coming up on the 6th of October, Gareth. We'll be facilitating a presentation from Welsh Government on the National Forest concept, and we'll have a panel discussion between farmers, landowners, woodland owners, and it's an opportunity for everybody to have their say and feedback to Welsh Government, as you said, on your thoughts and ideas about the project. So that's one definitely to look out for, and to learn more about it.
But is that on the 8th of October, Geraint? There was
6th of October.
6th, sorry. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a Tuesday evening.
And that's open, isn't it, to anyone to attend?
It is open, yeah. They need to register.
Right.
Yeah, it's online now, so they can book online, not a problem. Any issues, you can get in touch with David Owen or myself in Farming Connect, and we're sure to register you on. I should also mention, just draw it to a close, the training window is open now until the 30th of October, with more than 80 different courses available, including forestry courses, of course, subsidised by up to 80% through the training regime with Farm Connect. And the advisory service that can offer woodland management plans, but also the surgeries as well that can provide a one-to-one advice on woodland management, on new planting, and indeed, if anything, the Woodland Carbon Code as well. I just want to say thank you very, very much to everybody who has joined us tonight, and specifically Gareth. Thanks for the presentation and you answering the questions.